Brilliant. So apologies for not being able to be with you in person today. I'm Sarah Moller from the University of York and the National Centre for Atmospheric Science, and I'm going to talk to you about a project that's still in progress. So we haven't finished it yet. So it's going to be about why we were doing it, how we've been doing it, and some of the early insights. Next slide, please. So it's often been said that in every crisis there is opportunity, and I think that's because during a crisis the mechanisms that maintain inertia in a system that lock in the status quo are often weakened, and this can be a real opportunity to, perhaps an overused phrase, but to build back better. I think, as Tim was saying, things like social norms can change, people's values, and these are things which actually can change how a system operates, rather than just making small adjustments to the outputs or processes that we often do with general interventions in policy and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So in terms of context, global interlinked risks are increasing in frequency and magnitude and are recognised as being so. So on the right, I've got a figure from the World Economic Forum Global Risks Perception Survey, which just shows some of these global interlinked risks. And it could be said that governmental risk analyses need refining and mainstreaming in the context of this. So the example of sort of why this project's come about is UK recovery from COVID-19 has been said to need to balance the needs of the economy, societal cohesion and health. But actually in many of the framings of this, the environment isn't explicit and isn't particularly acknowledged, included. Yet there's a number of major environmentally mediated risks that can impact on these three pillars, and in fact over a relatively short time frame. There's also a lack of protocol for appraising systemic risk in a systematic, transparent and credible way. So there's lots of reports out there that talk about the general principles of risk management, but they don't often go further to prioritise responses or to look at intervention types, perhaps because it's so difficult to appraise risks that cut across many different disciplines and have wide-reaching impacts. So the perception was that many governments, and in fact academia itself, are behind in relation to the threat presented in their approaches for identifying these risks and for developing interventions, but also for mainstreaming those into the policy context. I think one of the things that shows the importance of the environment is being recognised is the Ministry of Defence reporting on environmental security in their next Global Strategic Trends report. And they're seeing this as underpinning social cohesion and national prosperity. So there's a real opportunity with recovery from COVID to integrate environmentally mediated risks into policy responses around COVID. Next slide, please. And so came about this project, Systemic Environmental Risk Analysis for Threats to UK Recovery from COVID. And basically it was in recognition of the fact that in both academia and government, understanding of systemic environmental risks is poor, and that perhaps the emergence and uncontrolled spread of a zoonotic pandemic illustrates this quite well. Next slide, please. So the aims of the project are to develop a generic protocol to assess systemic risk, and we'll use 3 case studies to do that I'll talk about in a minute. And we were hoping to identify previously neglected threats, to assess the likelihood and impact of different risk cascades within a dynamic socio-ecological context, to look at intervention points within those risk cascades in order to reduce the risk proactively, and to identify watch points in order to enable adaptive risk governance. And finally, to raise the profile of the need to appraise and mitigate complex risk, particularly in the context of rebuilding the nation after COVID. Next slide, please. And so this is sort of the project outline. So our 3 case studies are biosecurity, air quality and food security. I'm one of the co-Is leading on the air quality case study, so that's what I'm going to be talking about, but all the others have been progressing through the same system. While it's being trialled and developed on these 3 case studies, it's intended that it'll be relevant to a much wider range of risks than just those that we've been working on. It's hoped that we can integrate the outputs into DEFRA, Cabinet Office and Ministry of Defence through our interactions with them, and to ensure that UK strategies for recovery address systemic environmental risks. I think one of the points from DEFRA, who've actually been involved in this project from its inception, was that they have a futures team now within their Chief Scientific Advisor's office, and they're responsible for providing strategic foresight for DEFRA and for wider government on DEFRA issues, so environmental risks. And for them, it's all about trying to see things coming before it's too late and to maintain their adaptive capacity to react to these emerging threats and to seize any opportunities that are presented. So they see this work as useful to them, for example, when they're looking at transformational strategies. How do they look at the total risk picture? How do they ask whether their strategy might affect that? It's also seen to support the work that they're doing on how they manage complex risk and how they consider systems design more broadly. Next slide, please. So this is the project team, and I'm not going to go through everybody, but we're from the University of Reading, University of York and University of Surrey, and DEFRA itself. Our lead, our PI is Professor Tom Oliver from the University of Reading. And I think perhaps important to mention the two people from DEFRA, so that's Phil Tovey and Vanessa Pilley. And Phil is the head of futures, and Vanessa is leading on catastrophic risk. And it's been really important having them involved because of the context that they bring, and actually because they've challenged some of the ways that we were going to go about the project in order to help us to make it much more relevant for government and much more easily usable by government. So I think it's been really important to have their expertise involved. Next slide, please. One of the things that's been said about the project is that one of its strengths is the interdisciplinary approach. So across the 3 case studies, we've got people with very different expertise, but also within the case studies and between the different project team, we have lots of different disciplinary, lots of different disciplines. So on the left, I've got a word cloud, which is representative of the expertise of the people in the team, and I think shows the breadth of areas that are covered. Again, particularly important is the involvement of DEFRA and their work on how foresight works in government, how futures thinking works in government, and how all of this links into policy. On the right-hand side, I have just a visualization of the PESTLE acronym, which some of you might be aware of. And when we were building the teams that were working on each case study, so we had invited participants for each case study, we wanted to make sure that those participants covered the breadth of this space, so political, economic, social, technological, legal and regulatory and environmental. And so we selected our participants to try to cover that as well as possible. So in the equality space, they all had an interest in equality, but hopefully through covering all these different lenses on that issue. Next slide, please. So this was the process that we went through. We started off with an inception meeting, which was everybody all together. And then we had 6 workshops running 2 for each case study. And then we had a synthesis workshop, which actually was just yesterday. I'm going to focus on the equality strand, but as I said, the other case studies have progressed along the same process, so it should look pretty similar. Next slide, please. So the first step in what we did was to ask each of the participants we'd identified to produce 3 what we called risk cascades. So when I'm talking about risk cascades, they are pathways by which the risk, so in this case, air quality, impacts on human health. Each had to include one factor that was environmental, and these cascades were then collated, removing duplication, and they were combined into a single map. So on the right-hand side, I've got examples. So the top is just an example of one of those risk cascades that was submitted. So concerns about virus spread, decrease in use of public transport, that could lead to increase in the use of private cars and therefore health impacts from air pollution, or increase in the use of active travel. And that all leads on to health impacts from air pollution. And then at the bottom, I have the risk map that resulted from that, for one of the risk maps, sorry. We ended up with 5 risk maps within the air pollution case study, just to show that it's actually quite complex once all the risk cascades are put in and the links between them are made. Next slide, please. So then in our first workshop, we worked on these risk maps and asked people to, again, consider this whole PESTLE spectrum and to think about what the interventions could be that would affect how this risk plays out. So on the right-hand side, I've got an example. So from one of the risk cascades, over-optimistic expectations of penetration of electric vehicles into the fleet, causing electric vehicle costs not to drop as expected due to the muted demand. And then 2 of the interventions that were put forward, shown in yellow. What's quite interesting there is that you see there's a link between the two interventions, because there was the perception that one of the interventions could actually also influence the acceptability of another intervention. We asked the participants to think about both preventative measures, so reducing the likelihood, but also mitigation measures, so reducing the risk, or reducing the impact, sorry. And then we also asked them to think about proactive, so before the risk was realised, and reactive measures. And I think in terms of the reactive measures, we were cognizant that it was really important that we knew when we might need to enact that intervention. And so we asked them also to think about watch points. Next slide, please. So in terms of watch points, these were data sets that could be analysed, initiatives that could help to track how risks were being realised, and then also to think about who the actors were that were involved. So who's involved in gathering the data, in the monitoring, in interpreting the data to see what was happening. And then who are the people who need that information coming out of that data, who could implement the responses. And again, on the right-hand side, I've just shown an example of one of the watch points that was identified in blue, so that you can see that they're shown differently within the risk maps. Next slide, please. So this is an example of what they looked like after that workshop. And as you can see, it's got even more complicated and harder to navigate. But I think what's interesting is that some of the interventions have multiple lines going into the risk cascade, showing that they can have an impact on more than one part of the risk cascade, and that there are some more complex links. It was reflected from DEFRA that through taking this kind of risk cascade approach and identifying interventions at multiple points down a risk cascade, that provided a way of adaptively managing risk. So if an opportunity for an intervention was missed or an intervention was ineffective, it allowed them to have the next step of, well, how do we stop it at the next stage of contagion? How do we stop it at the next stage? What's the next intervention that we can look at to try to minimize the impact of a risk? Next slide, please. So then in between the first and second workshops, our postdocs developed some risk narratives. So essentially, they took these risk maps and broke them down again into linear cascades, but this time on an agreed map that had been agreed by all participants and included all of their inputs. And narratives were developed to describe how those cascades worked. And participants were asked to score them for their likelihood, for their impact, and for our current capacity to reduce them. And I think one of the things worth noting is that in terms of the capacity to reduce them, where that's very poor, that could be either because the risk is neglected, so we're not really aware of it, it's not something that's well known, or it could be that there's very limited risk reduction in place, or even that there is risk reduction in place, but it's actually very ineffective. Next slide, please. So this gives an example of one of the linear cascades. So in purple, we have the starting point, which is, in this case, new product formulation or the inclusion of new components in existing product formulations, or the introduction of new processes that emit new chemicals. And then on the far right-hand side, we have the output. So that's the health impacts of air pollution. The green boxes show you the progression through the pathway, and the orange boxes are what we called risk multipliers, so things that exacerbate the problem. And in this case, we're looking at, as I said, new chemicals, so novel pollutants in the atmosphere. And then that leads to potentially harmful pollutants already in the atmosphere through the initial product, or through the degradation of the product once it gets into the atmosphere. There's no awareness of the potential health impacts resulting from the use of these new products. Moreover, there's no ability to detect the emissions or concentrations, and no baseline information regarding the concentrations before the use of it. This results in a limited or no ability to regulate, or in fact, even to design regulation to look at these species, and hence a limited or no ability to reduce the emissions. Overall, that means there's the potential for a really large time lag from the start of the use of a product to the time that it causes a health impact. The ultimate output is that leads to health impacts from air pollution, and potentially over the longer term. And one of the risks is that could lead to acute or widespread health impacts before the link to the novel product is actually made. So it's just an example of one of the risk cascades. Next slide, please. So the next step was we asked, we carried out a prioritization from the scorings that our participants gave it. This was really just to focus down what we needed to do in the next workshop. So we selected 4 narratives, which were either rated as high likelihood or high impact. And those were the uptake of electric vehicles, extreme weather resulting from climate change, novel pollutants, and changes in domestic emissions due to changes in work patterns. Next slide, please. So these are what we focused on in our next workshop, which was a deep dive on interventions. And in this one, we were exploring the interventions on those cascades in terms of their effectiveness, their complementarity, the barriers to putting them in place, any equity issues, and their multifunctionality. And these 4 questions are just the questions that we asked participants to think about relating to those 4 things. With the bottom question about co-benefits or negative impacts, thinking about the multifunctionality. Next slide, please. And following on from that scoring, again, the postdocs put together this slide, which is preliminary. So at the moment, we've only had the team scores analysed, but we are asking the participants to take part. So hopefully we'll get some more scores in from that. And what we did was we looked at the interventions proposed by the other case studies and assessed them for what their impact would be on air quality. So in this case, the deeper red, the area where the white dot is, the higher the multifunctionality of the intervention. And those that are completely in the white space were seen to only have an impact on the case study that was being considered. Now, obviously, there might be multifunctionality across lots of other systems. And at the moment, that hasn't been taken into account at all, just for the bounds of what we could get done in the project. Next slide, please. So then, in terms of things that we've got left to do, yesterday we had our synthesis workshop. So we got our stakeholders back together and we had a look at the 3 case studies and explored these multifunctional interventions. So the ones that sat right in the centre, and had a look at how they might be implemented in real life, what the barriers might be, who the winners and losers might be, what might be the issues around implementing those kinds of interventions. This was partly out of some thinking that these interventions that were highly multifunctional tended to be less well defined than the really specific interventions on one case study. And so how do we get better definition of those slightly more maybe sort of far-reaching and out there interventions. And then on the 16th of December, we've got our final communications event. So that's for people to hear the outcomes of the project. So we've got a very busy month coming up trying to go through all of this and pull out the real findings. Next slide. Oh, sorry. And on this at the bottom, I've got the logos of all the people who are currently signed up, well, of all the institutions that aren't academic that are signed up to this final workshop. So at the moment, we've got quite good representation from across government, which is really nice to see. Next slide, please. So as I said, it's a work in progress, but some initial observations are the interdisciplinarity is a real strength and has allowed us to identify interventions that we wouldn't have been able to. But even then, some of the comments were about once you start looking at these interventions, we need to include a much wider group of stakeholders who know about much wider systems for multifunctionality, but also for how these interventions might play out and what impacts they might have. The involvement of DEFRA from the initial project development and as team members has been hugely beneficial to the project and actually has massively increased our ability to have any impact. DEFRA see this as closely related to their work on risk and the wider systems approach being deployed in DEFRA. They're currently developing a futures vulnerability assessment covering food, water and air systems. And they see the findings from this work as being source intelligence to go into that work. I think in terms of the interdisciplinarity, one of the comments from one of our participants was that they've been involved in lots of interdisciplinary projects, but this one seemed special in the way that it was using the different disciplines. And another said that the way that it involved actors from both inside and outside academia and leaders from outside of that space, looking at interventions meant that they felt the things that were being identified were more tangible and down to earth than perhaps might have been the case if it had just been academics involved. And then I think one of the things that's sort of emerging from this is that many of the interventions identified could be broadly grouped as either vague but deep, so they could really lead to systems change, but actually the way they were defined was a very aspirational and not particularly implementable description of what they were. or they were tangible but siloed, so those interventions that sort of sat within one case study and could be easily implemented. And I think that's got real implications for how we use the outputs and how we design interventions and implementation of those interventions off the back of this kind of risk assessment process. So this is something that we'd like to explore further in our ongoing analysis. And last slide, please. So finally, I'd just like to say thank you to the Whole Risk team, because obviously I'm presenting on their behalf, particularly to NERC for their funding and to DEFRA for their involvement throughout. And thank you to all of you for listening.